So I'm a Dutch resident, or a citizen, as Virginia said. We have lived here for 20 years. All our 3 children were born here. They actually have dual citizenship, which was quite a process as well. But one of the things that I did want to do is make sure that they had their, both nationalities, as this country is the country that they have grown up in. My husband and myself, we have managed to get permanent residency, and I have written a blog about applying for that on the Amnesty website. In that, there I put a public apology to my husband, because 2 years ago I looked at all these boxes of paperwork in the attic and said, "Can we just, go through them and chuck them out? It's just too much space." And he was like, "Yeah, we'll do that a bit later." And I was really cross at the time, and so, my apologies here to my husband again, and I will keep repeating that, is that I am so glad that he did not listen to me, because in those boxes was all our paperwork that we needed to apply. We didn't throw away passports, all passports we still could, that's the one thing that our immigration lawyer said you should send with your permanent residency application, because that shows that you continuously had your Dutch citizenship while you were applying, even though the person that we then, was processing our application when, I'm going completely off script now, but the process with permanent residency is that you fill in all the paperwork online, and then you make an appointment. And this is terribly Kafkaesque, because you fill in the paperwork, you send the send button, you pay for it, and then you have to make an appointment within 6 days. And then you have to go to one of the councils. We rang about 10 officers to get an appointment, and they didn't have an appointment. So we ended up travelling an hour. Luckily they still had an appointment, because if you don't do it within those 6 days, you can start all over again. Anyway, we got it. Whatever it's worth, I don't know, but there you are. Now, actually, I'm here as an Amnesty International activist, and I'm also going to talk about depressing things. I do apologise again for that. That's what my life is at the moment in time. But I'm going to give a bit of background why I think we are where we are as EU citizens. And I'm regional representative, but I'm also a member of the Cambridge City Group. There's a couple of members here, I won't point them out, we'll look at you now, of the Egle Group. And the Egle Group is brilliant. And I do suggest, if you haven't gone to their events, or you're not on the mailing list, that please do so. So as an Amnesty activist, I want to focus on refugee rights. But first of all, let me make clear that Amnesty is a political organisation, but it's also non-partisan. I'm going to try my best. Amnesty doesn't have a position on Brexit, but as a human rights organisation, it of course very much has a position on rights and on democracy. Amnesty has spoken out against the Henry VIII clauses in the EU withdrawal bill, and of course also with regards to EU citizens' rights. You may have seen the Amnesty petition half a year ago, asking the government to guarantee EU citizens' rights after Brexit, which was signed by about 30,000 people. And I wrote a blog as part of that campaign, which was entitled "My Family's Right to a Home." However, before I agreed to write the blog, I did run it past our immigration lawyer. I asked her if it could in any way badly affect our permanent residency application. As of course, that would not just be me, that would also be my children and my husband. So, I have that responsibility as a mother and a wife. Luckily, she didn't think that would be the case, so I went ahead. However, feeling that I had to run it past my lawyer, whether this could affect my rights and my application, in itself was very scary. Now, you may think, well, it's a bit over the top, isn't it?
I don't think it was at all.
Possibly, maybe. However, I was cautious based very much on my experience and knowledge as an activist for refugees and their right to sanctuary. I base this on how badly, at least in the last 15 years, and probably even before then, the Home Office has treated asylum seekers and refugees. Now let me illustrate this. Last March in Cambridge we organised a screening of the film Call Me Kuchu. This is a film about LGBTI activists in Uganda. Uganda is one of the countries where sections of the government and parliament have tried several times to adopt a law that would make homosexuality punishable by death. One of Uganda's main newspapers, the Rolling Stone, used to publish pictures of people perceived to be gay or lesbian. The result of this was that people would be ousted by their families, they would lose their job, they'd have to go into hiding, and they would be beaten up in the streets. David Kato, Uganda's first openly gay man, was killed in that way during the filming of the documentary. The reason that we showed this film for the second time, 5 years after its release, was because we had just helped, or members of our group, as Amnesty we would not help individual cases as such, at least not as a local group, but members in our group had helped. Aisha, a Ugandan lesbian, with her asylum appeal. Luckily she won her appeal and she was able to join us for a pre-filmed speaker event alongside a university researcher of politics, gender and sexuality. We had helped crowdfund for good lawyers. A lot of people in Cambridge helped out with that. And we had asked the lawyers while the appeal was going on, what can we do? One of the things that the lawyer said is, don't organise any campaigning events. So hence I did run it past my lawyer when I was applying for permanent residency. Aisha talked about how she was persecuted in Uganda, how she escaped, how she thought she had found a way to stay here, how one route after the other was blocked, how in the end she applied for asylum and lost, how she wasn't believed by the Home Office despite having the physical evidence of her ordeal and it being well known what lesbians faced in Uganda, how she ended up in immigration detention, and how in the end we all tried to help her, and thank God her appeal was successful. In the meantime, she had lost years of her life. This was 5, 6, 7 years. I actually asked her at the beginning, because I was chairing, how shall I introduce you? And she said, well, I'm just Aisha. I said, but what do you, what's your profession? What's your job? Well, she said, I'd like to be a nurse, but I've never, I've done some caring work, I've never done. So she had basically lost her identity throughout that process. And she could, and I insisted to, giving her a bit of that, at least when when she was talking. Now my then 18-year-old son, he also came along to this event, and as I was chairing, I could actually see his face. And his face went to shock, to disbelief, to more shock and to more disbelief. And afterwards I said to him, do you realise that the same Home Office who dealt with her asylum application will also deal with our permanent residency? And his reaction was, oh shit. Now, oh shit is a perfectly inadequate way to describe the actions of the Home Office that we have campaigned against and are still campaigning against. Destitution is a policy that stops the benefits of failed asylum seekers who cannot be returned to their country, thus ending up in prostitution or anything else that keeps them alive. Disbelief is a policy where LGBTI people were asked, and now I know that what we have to take with us to permanent residency applications, but LGBTI asylum seekers were at a time, luckily they stopped this, asked to film themselves having sex.
What?
To prove that they weren't faking being gay. Now, who in the Home Office would, what kind of human thinks about this? And I'm not, I wish I was making it up. I really wish I was making it up. One of the things that we campaigned for as Amnesty was also that the Home Office made better asylum decisions. And one case that stuck with me. There was a 15-year-old girl. Her father was arrested and the police officers said, we're going to rape and kill your daughter. So when he got out, the first thing he did was basically put his daughter on a plane and get her away.
Yeah.
Logical, isn't it? Her asylum application was refused because she couldn't have suffered a trauma because when she was here, she didn't go and see a therapist. Now, indefinite detention, there's a petition going around for that. It's a policy that means that some people have been incarcerated for more than 2 years without committing a crime, and some of them, well, their asylum application is still ongoing, which is illegal. It's against every rule and procedure written down, but the Home Office gets away and has gotten away with it in the last 15, 20 years, time and time again. So, actually I could talk for a long, long time about these kinds of human rights violations that have been committed against irregular migrants, against migrants and asylum seekers. There's just one thing I do want to mention, and that's unaccompanied refugee children, who are, as you can imagine, at great risk. First of all, the government has not implemented the Dublin rules that is part of the EU asylum application. So in Calais there was actually a huge amount of time taken up by giving the children who under Dublin, who basically, as soon as they should have registered, should have, be put on a plane and sent to the UK to be reunited with their uncle or the brother or whatever. But they went through the process. These kids are in Calais, you know what Calais was like. And so they didn't comply with that, and the government had to be pushed time and time again, every time fundraising, crowdfunding for a single child. So that's the first thing. And then you've probably also heard about the Dubs Amendment, campaigned for by Lord Dubs, who himself came to the UK as a Jewish child refugee as part of the Kindertransport in the 1930s, late 1930s. Now, the Dubs Amendment was agreed by Parliament as a modern-day Kindertransport. And last year we had, in Cambridge, we held a refugee conference, and as part of that, somebody managed to set up a local lobbying group, basically around the whole of East Anglia. And another in that lobbying group, that councils had said they would take 40 children. So, East Anglia, 40 children, I can't remember how much the overall was, but that was quite something that all these local authorities had, by local people had asked, do you want to take up children? However, the Home Office didn't assign children to those local councils. And only, a few. And it's only now that the last 250 places have been filled, or that the Home Office has finally said, okay, yes, we'll also send the last 250 children that were agreed. So in the meantime, those children have been, in Calais, sleeping rough, or in centres. I mean, some may have been cared for quite well, but we also know that a lot of them have not been cared for very well. So that's all additional trauma that they've experienced. Now, child refugees are also the only refugees who have no right of family reunion. In other words, when a 14-year-old gets asylum, the parents cannot join the child. Whereas if the parents get asylum, the child can join. So, you probably understand why I would say that the Home Office has a culture of being unreasonable, unjust, unpredictable and incompetent. This so-called hostile environment was a deliberate decision by senior people and politicians, which doesn't mean, of course, in the Home Office there are competent people who want to do the right thing. Let's not forget that. But I have heard of campaigners and lawyers explaining the law and immigration rules to Home Office officials, and it's also a well-known fact among campaigners that if activists turn up at immigration hearings, that the judgments are fairer and more in favour of the refugee or migrant. So, knowing all this, it doesn't come as a surprise then when you read about the Home Office accidentally sending out letters to EU citizens that they are going to be deported. Yeah. This hostile environment is meant to encourage refugees, immigrants, as well as EU citizens to self-relief. Now, we also in all this, we shouldn't forget the role of the tabloid press, who for decades have been inciting hatred against immigrants and refugees, printing blatant untruths, without any consequences. And words matter. Refugees and migrants have been dehumanized and othered by both the press and politicians, and some people turn words into action. One of our campaigns has been against the rise of hate crime, because suddenly hate is allowed again. And that's not only with regards to EU citizens and migrants, but also hate crimes have gone up towards other groups, for example, LGBTI people and disabled people. Having said all that, of course this evening is about EU citizens' rights, but sadly the scene has been set by how refugee rights have been and are trashed consistently under various consecutive British governments in collaboration with the press, and to some extent also in collaboration with wider society, who didn't speak up for refugees and migrants. If we value our own rights, we need to speak up for other people's rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
And most importantly, if we value the rule of law, then we shouldn't allow governments to flaunt laws, rules and regulations, or, for example, ignore Parliament. With regards to the adopted children, the first fight was getting it through Parliament, and the second fight was actually for the Home Office to comply with the law. So, after all this, let's do a bit of good news as well. So, first of all, through all this, I do have an idea that at least part of the population is starting to understand what has happened to this country. People are starting to understand that refugees and migrant workers have been othered, and that the British government, the Home Office in particular, isn't reliable or fair. And secondly, campaigning does work. I brought some letters and petitions, one about waiving the profit-making fee for children when they are applying for British citizenship, including waiving the fee for children in care. And there's a petition to end indefinite detention, so at least Amnesty is not against immigration detention, because sometimes, that may well be necessary, but it shouldn't be able to go on and on and on and on and on. There should be a limit. And in this case, it would already help if the Home Office, just applies their own rules. The rule is that you can only be detained when your asylum process or whatever process is finished, and the Home Office has bought the tickets for your flight. Inevitably, that basically never happens. So it does feel like taking water to the sea every now and again. But we have achieved some successes. The Dutch Amendment has been achieved. Those children wouldn't have, been here / coming here if we hadn't all campaigned for that. And we have a long way to go to change hearts and minds. But this is my home. This is a country where, I want to stay, where my children are living. So it's really worth fighting for. And then I keep coming across more and more people who are willing to join me in that fight. So thank you.